The crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow across the ballroom, and Margaret Chen stood near the champagne fountain trying to look like she belonged there. Her emerald dress had cost more than she wanted to admit, and her heels were already pinching her feet. But tonight wasn't about comfort. Tonight was about showing Richard that she had moved on. She spotted him across the room and her stomach tightened. Richard looked exactly the same, with his easy smile and confident posture as he leaned in close to the blonde woman beside him. The same woman he'd left Margaret for 6 months ago after 12 years together. Margaret turned away and blinked hard against the sudden sting in her eyes. She was 53 years old. Too old for this kind of heartbreak, she'd told herself. Too old to be starting over. But here she was at a charity gala she had no business attending, clutching a glass of champagne and pretending her world hadn't fallen apart. "Excuse me." The voice came from behind her, and Margaret turned to find a tall man in an impeccably tailored tuxedo. He had silver hair at his temples and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he offered a gentle smile. "I couldn't help but notice you're standing alone," he said. "Would you care to dance?" Margaret hesitated. She glanced across the room where Richard was now looking in her direction. "Perfect timing. Could you dance with me?" she whispered, leaning slightly toward the stranger. "My ex is watching." The man's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Understanding perhaps, or maybe amusement. He extended his hand. "It would be my pleasure." His name was James, and he danced like someone who had attended cotillions as a boy. He held her at a respectful distance and guided her across the floor with practiced ease. Margaret found herself relaxing despite her nervousness. "Thank you for this," she said quietly. "I know it's silly, but I just needed him to think I was doing okay." "It's not silly at all," James replied. "We all need to protect our dignity sometimes." They danced through 2 songs, and Margaret was surprised to find herself actually enjoying it. James asked thoughtful questions about her work as a librarian and listened with genuine interest when she talked about the reading program she'd started for seniors at the community center. He didn't talk much about himself except to mention that he worked in business and had recently moved back to the city after years abroad. When the music ended, James walked her to the edge of the dance floor. "Thank you again," Margaret said. "You really saved me tonight." "The pleasure was entirely mine, Margaret." He paused and then added, "If you'd ever like to have coffee and talk about books, I'd enjoy that very much." Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "I'd like that too." They exchanged numbers, and then James was called away by someone who needed to speak with him urgently. Margaret watched him go, feeling lighter than she had in months. The following Monday, Margaret was reshelving books in the biography section when her assistant Emily rushed over with wide eyes. "Margaret, you need to see this." Emily thrust her phone forward and Margaret squinted at the screen. It was a news article with a large photo of James in a business suit standing in front of a modern office building. "Tech billionaire James Morrison returns to oversee local philanthropy initiatives," the headline read. Margaret's hands went numb. "That's him, isn't it?" Emily asked excitedly. "The guy who donated all that money to build the new children's wing at the library." "Oh my God, Margaret, did you meet him at the gala?" Margaret nodded slowly as she read the article. James Morrison had founded a technology company 30 years ago and sold it for billions. He'd spent the last decade traveling and working with charitable organizations around the world. And apparently he was now the library's largest donor and the reason they'd been able to expand their programs. He was also technically her boss, since the library board reported to the foundation he chaired. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Good morning. This is James. I was wondering if you were free for that coffee we discussed. Perhaps Thursday afternoon." Margaret stared at the message. Part of her wanted to pretend she'd never met him. How could she possibly have coffee with James Morrison, the billionaire philanthropist? She was just Margaret Chen, a divorced librarian who still drove the same Honda Civic she'd bought 15 years ago. But another part of her remembered how kind his eyes had been and how safe she'd felt when they danced. How he'd listened when she talked about her work as though it mattered. As though she mattered. She typed back, "Thursday works for me." They met at a small cafe near the library and James arrived in jeans and a sweater, looking nothing like a billionaire. He ordered black coffee and an apple turnover, and when Margaret apologized for not recognizing him at the gala, he waved it away. "Please don't apologize. It was refreshing to meet someone who didn't know who I was." "I feel foolish," Margaret admitted. Using you to make my ex jealous when you were just being kind. James reached across the table and gently touched her hand. Margaret the first asked you to dance because I wanted to. Not because I felt obligated. And I asked you to coffee because I enjoyed talking with you. Your ex-husband has nothing to do with any of this. Over the next few weeks they fell into an easy friendship. James would stop by the library after his foundation meetings and they'd talk about books and life. He told her about the loneliness of success and how he'd built an empire but lost his marriage in the process. Margaret shared her own story of how she devoted herself to Richard's career only to be left behind when he decided he wanted a different life. I thought I'd have more time, Margaret said one evening as they walked through the park near her apartment. More time to figure out who I was beyond being Richard's wife. Now I'm starting over at 53 and some days I feel ancient. You're not ancient, James said firmly. You're at the beginning of something new. That takes courage, Margaret. More courage than most people have. By the time autumn arrived they were inseparable. James introduced Margaret to his daughter Claire, who hugged her warmly and told her father it was about time he met someone who made him smile again. Margaret invited James to her book club where the other members spent the entire evening grilling him about his favorite authors instead of discussing the assigned novel. One Saturday afternoon James took Margaret to see a property his foundation had acquired. It was an old mansion that overlooked the river with gardens that had gone wild with neglect. I want to turn it into a community center, James explained as they walked through the overgrown paths. A place where people can take art classes or learn new skills. Where seniors can gather without feeling isolated. I was hoping you might help me design the library space. Margaret looked at the beautiful old building and felt tears well up. Why are you doing all this, James? Really? He turned to face her and took both her hands in his. Because I spent 30 years accumulating wealth and I forgot what it was for. Money means nothing if it doesn't make the world better. If it doesn't help people like you who dedicate their lives to serving others. He paused and his voice grew softer. And because I'm falling in love with you, Margaret, and I want to build something beautiful together. Margaret couldn't speak. She'd spent so long feeling invisible and disposable. Richard had made her believe she was too old and too ordinary to be loved again. But here was James looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. I'm falling in love with you too, she whispered. They kissed there in the overgrown garden surrounded by possibility. A year later Margaret stood in the ballroom where they'd first met. The charity gala was in full swing and this time she wore a burgundy gown that James had helped her pick out. Her hand rested in his as they swayed to the music and she felt completely at peace. Thank you for dancing with me that night, she said, smiling up at him. Thank you for letting me, James replied. Across the room Margaret caught sight of Richard with his new wife. He was staring at her and for a moment their eyes met. But Margaret felt nothing except perhaps a distant gratitude. If he hadn't left she never would have found this new chapter of her life. She never would have discovered that love could be gentle and generous and real. She rested her head against James's shoulder and closed her eyes as they danced. Sometimes the best things in life come when you're not looking for them. When you're just trying to get through the evening with your dignity intact. When you're brave enough to accept a stranger's kindness and see where it leads. Margaret had learned that it's never too late to start over. Never too late to be loved. Never too late to dance.